Today, we're diving deep into some ancient religious texts to uncover where human malice actually started and how the whole fall of man went down. We're going to look closely at the source material to map out exactly how these foundational stories were structured across different traditions.
I mean, think about it for a second. Where does human malice actually come from? We usually just default to blaming ourselves, humanity, right? But if you look at the ancient texts, they actually point to a completely different starting line, and it's pretty wild.
Looking at the book of Isaiah, it reveals that the very first sin wasn't murder or theft or anything like that. It was actually just an angel's ambition to be exactly like God. We're talking pure, unchecked ambition here, literally wanting to place a throne right above the stars.
So, the source identifies this deep-seated desire to usurp the Creator as the absolute root of angelic sin. It sets the stage for the whole shebang. And to be clear, ambition here isn't just a healthy drive for success. It's this incredibly dangerous, literal desire to be God. That is exactly where malice gets its very first foothold. Over in the Quran, the text highlights this massive pivotal moment. God commands the angels to bow down to his new earthly representative, Adam. And the entire heavenly host bows down except for one, Iblis. He just flat out refuses, and that single choice sets off this massive cosmic chain reaction. Now, this part brilliantly illustrates the why behind that rebellion. Iblis felt this deep inherent superiority. Why? Because he was made of fire, while Adam was, just made of mud. So Iblis is actually using his own physical makeup to justify his defiance. Because of this arrogance, God immediately banishes Iblis. And this really cements the idea that pride, which the text defines here as despising others out of a false sense of superiority regarding your talents or appearance, is the true birthplace of wickedness. It wasn't just him being disobedient, right? It was this deeply rooted contempt for another being.
Now transformed into a demon, Iblis vows absolute revenge. He promises to relentlessly attack humanity from literally all sides just to stop Adam from fulfilling his role. And listen to this spatial language in the text, coming from their front, their back, their right, and their left. It's chilling. The ultimate goal of this whole spiritual siege? To make sure most of humanity just becomes totally ungrateful.
So all this brings up a crucial question. Why did God give such a strict rule in Eden in the first place? Was it just some arbitrary test? Well, the text suggests it was actually a direct protective warning against that exact vengeful demonic threat we just talked about. Basically, God was putting up a necessary guardrail. Completely challenges the literal story we've all grown up with. So let's unpack the evidence step by step. Setting the stage with Section 1, 2 perspectives on Paradise Lost. First up, the Bible's tale of temptation and the fall. In Genesis 2:17, God issues a very clear, undeniable directive. He says, "You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." It's the ultimate line drawn in the sand, carrying the ultimate consequence. But, as the text outlines, a cunning serpent steps in and deliberately deceives Eve. The serpent promises that if she eats it, her eyes will be open and she'll actually become just like God, knowing good and evil. Drawn by the promise of wisdom, she takes the fruit, eats it, and gives some to Adam, who also eats. What follows is practically a tragic comedy of human nature. We can call it the Genesis blame game. Once their eyes are opened, they immediately realize they're naked and they frantically scramble to sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. When God inevitably confronts them, literally nobody takes accountability. First, God asks Adam what he did. Adam immediately points the finger at Eve, essentially saying, "Hey, the woman you gave me, she made me do it." Then God asks Eve, and she immediately points at the snake, saying, "The serpent deceived me." The resulting punishment for this disobedience is incredibly severe. Humanity is cursed to sweat for their daily bread, inevitably return to dust, and they're exiled entirely, cast out east of the Garden of Eden. Let's move to our next section and see how this builds. The Quran reveals the devil's target. The Quran introduces a crucial piece of the puzzle here: Satan's origin story in this cosmic conflict. Known as Iblis, he outright refused God's command to bow to Adam. Because of this massive arrogance, he became an unbeliever and made a chilling vow, which we find in Quran 7:17. He says, "I will attack them from the front, from the back, from the right, and from the left." He is explicitly declaring a war, and his goal is to completely sabotage Adam's intended role as God's representative on earth. So how exactly does the Quran frame God's warning in light of this cosmic enemy? Notice the specific framing. God tells Adam and Eve to enjoy the garden freely. However, they are strictly warned not to approach this tree.
If they do, the text says they will become wrongdoers, meaning they'd be committing a deeply unrighteous act. Satan, meanwhile, uses heavy psychological manipulation. He whispers to them specifically to expose what was previously hidden from them, their nakedness. He even swears a literal oath, promising them that he is simply a good advisor.
Now for the pivot point of our explainer, Section 3, Decoding the Metaphor.
Now, what's really fascinating about the source material is how it defines the very concept of a metaphor in Scripture. A metaphor isn't just a random poetic flourish. It's a highly structured method used by ancient authors to convey deep, complex messages. It relies on three specific elements: a topic, an image or concept, and a point of similarity. By applying this specific analytical lens, our source argues that the Scriptures are using physical, relatable imagery to encode a much more profound reality about human nature.
Which brings us to Section 4, Uncovering the True Identity of the Forbidden Tree.
Here is the core argument presented by our source material, and it's a massive paradigm shift. The texts mention two key trees in the center of the garden. According to this interpretation, the tree of life is actually a metaphorical representation of the male. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a representation of the female. Following this logic, the physical act of eating the fruit is not about diet at all. It's a metaphor for premarital sexual relations. In this view, God's strict commandment was actually a warning against committing an unrighteous act of premarital intimacy, an act which, the source notes, Islamic law strictly penalizes today.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the source supports its interpretation just by looking closely at the specific vocabulary used in the Jewish text. Just one chapter after the fall, in Genesis 4:1, the text says, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. The scripture explicitly uses the word know or knowledge to describe sexual relations. Suddenly, the tree of knowledge takes on a much more specific, intimate meaning within the context of the story.
Finally, Section 5, The True Cost and Outcomes of the Fall.
If the forbidden act wasn't just grabbing a piece of fruit, but rather a premature violation of a sacred boundary between two people, well then the resulting punishment must align with the gravity of that reality. Let's contrast the outcomes. The texts describe literal, physical outcomes we're all familiar with, being physically expelled from the Garden of Eden and wearing physical fig leaves to cover their newly exposed nakedness. But the source points out that the psychological and spiritual outcomes are far more devastating, resulting in marital enmity, stunted development, and a spiritual death that completely alter the trajectory of humanity.
So, the crucial point is unpacking these highly specific biological and theological claims made by the source text regarding the aftermath of their actions. First, God declares a fundamental rift, stating in the text that they are now enemies to each other, introducing marital enmity. But the source takes this even further, claiming that by committing this premature act of premarital relations, Adam actually stunted the physical maturation of Eve's prefrontal cortex, the specific part of the brain responsible for character formation. The source describes this as the destruction of Eve's human personality, labeling it a literal spiritual murder. Furthermore, because of this massive failure in discipline, Adam himself failed to mature into his intended role as God's earthly representative and the sovereign over all creation.
Ultimately, the source text argues that because of this metaphorical fall, humanity was severely reduced. Instead of maturing into God's capable earthly representatives overseeing creation, humanity fell to the status of mere servants, restricted to just praising God. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. Is the story of Eden actually a coded warning about the destruction of human potential? It is a perspective that completely reframes how we might read these ancient scriptures. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the deeper meanings of the information around you.